David, he says, by saying David, he says, Abba Mari, told me or asked me or whatever it may be. And certainly when he's speaking to him directly, to refer to him, to address him by that lashon of chashivus. Okay, well now we'll come back to some details here, Mr. Hashem. So that's one point. Then the Shacharach continues, Ha-yishem aviv kishem acherim. Let's say you're talking to or about other people. If you want, there's a copy of the Shacharach that we're reading here under that device. Ha-yishem aviv kishem acherim mishane shmam. We're in Siv Beis, towards the end of Siv Beis. Mishane shmam. If you want to refer to them, call them or mention their name, so Mishane Shmam, you should change their name, meaning not to use their name directly. Imhu Shem Palai, Imhu Shem Shu Plai, if it's an unusual name, She'ein HaKol Regilin L'Krosabo. If it's an unusual name, so that your father happens to have a name, or mother happens to have a name which is unusual, and you have a friend or someone else that you want to call or you want to talk about and mention their name, which they also have that unusual name. So then Mishan Shmam, you should not do it. You should not use their name if it's the same as your parent's name. Now the Ramah says Aval Shem Shirigilim Bo, but if it's a common name, Mutter Likros Acherim Shelo b'fanav. If it's a common name and you want to, then you could use that name to refer to someone else who has the same name, but shelo b'fanav. So it seems to me meduik in the Ramah that in front of your parents you can't use their name even to refer to someone else, even if it's the most standard name of the book. Someone's name is David or Chaim or whatever, Avram, is any of the common names, which there are countless number of people of Yidden that have that name, but to use that name even to refer to that other person in the presence of your father or mother, when it's their name as well, you can't do. But Shalom b'fanav you could do, and then the diak would also be that if it's an unusual name, then even Shalom b'fanav you can't, because the only heter I'm saying the heter is a common name Shalom b'fanav. Much better an unusual name is also even Shalom b'fanav. So we have two concepts, or one, not to actually refer to the parent by their name when you're actually addressing them or referring to them, and B, not even to use their name for someone else who has the name with under certain context or with certain details. Now on this, so there's a machlokes Taz and Shach here on the extent of this. So let's first see the Taz. The Taz Sifka and Dalid, I believe you have it there. It's where it says Imhu Shem Paloi, where it says that you shouldn't use their name to refer to someone else if it's an unusual name. Mashma, says the Taz, Deberesha Le'inyan Likroso B'Shmo, to call your parent, to refer to your parent by their name, Asur Shelo B'Fanav Afilu Be'eno Plai. To actually refer to your parent by their own name, and Shelo B'Fanav, that's Asur even where it's not unusual, because... Sorry? So we'll get that. Very good. So we'll get one of those. The question is going to be, is it any different when I'm... Well, let me just get... You're saying if you're the Gabe calling up your father, or if somebody asks you your name... Okay, so we'll get to that. Whether you could say your name in Ben, your father's name. Okay, it's one of the many points which hopefully we'll discuss. It's Hashem. So the Taz is saying that if it's Shalom B'Fanav, even if it's Shalom B'Fanav, to actually refer to your parent, you can't do, and even if it's a regular name, because the only difference of Shem Plai came in where when we want to extend the Isser to even referring to somebody else who has the same name, Shalom B'Fanav. That's where we made this distinction of Plai. But if it's the parent's name, and if you're referring to the parent, it makes a difference whether the name is usual or unusual.
Is this all referring to a Hebrew name? Meaning if I have an English name
Okay.
Is that automatically unusual, or is that?
Well, okay. No, I wouldn't say it's automatically unusual. What I think is with the idea is it's the name that they're basically known by go by. So if they're only known by one name, or if they're known by both names, then that name would be us. No, there's a parent who goes by their English name, or even if they don't go by it exclusively, but many people know them by their English name. So then it would apply to that. If not, well, let's say they're only known by their English name and their Hebrew name they only use when they get an aliyah or something, but people don't know them by that name, then I think it would apply exclusively to the English name. Whereas the other way around, if they're only known by the Hebrew name, so even though they happen to have an English name, but nobody even knows them by that name. So I guess, well, certainly, so still we have to make a distinction. To actually call them by their name, that clearly would be us, or even whatever the name is, whether it's English name or Hebrew name, whether it's the name that's used or not. But to call other people by that name, then the chara would make a difference, and maybe we'll see about that. Someone's referring to whether that that idea. Or
nicknames are also.
What is that?
Nicknames are also an issue.
So what they say is it depends how the father is referred to, the father or the mother, what they are called. In other words, here let's see. A lot of svarim on this that go into many different details, and let's see from this. Where did I see this? Okay, so this is a sefer called Ura Kavodi by Rabbi Landinsky. Yesh lehistape, he says. One could have the following question: Im Shem Aviv Yitzchak. That's really his name. Ve'ilu Hashem shemishtam shebo kulo b'targum le'Yiddish Itza. People call him Itzka, whatever. So Ha'im Shari l'kros Hachem sheshmam Yitzchak. Could you call somebody else Yitzchak? Nobody. Your father's name is Yitzchak. Nobody calls him Yitzchak. They call him, Itzka, whatever. So. So he writes, "Beben Ishchai Kasav the Einis Rebazeh the Nicker the Lo Kari Aviv." It's clearly not when you're not referring to your father. It's clearly that you're not referring to your father because nobody calls your father Yitzchak. It happens to be his name; it's his proper name, but nobody calls him that. On the other hand, he brings from the Chut Shani, Im Shem Aviv Eliezer Acha Olim Karam Lo Lazer Aser L'Krol La'acher B'Shem Eliezer. He says you're not allowed to do that. So. We'll see. Okay, so now we're going to discuss something from the Jewish Zikras Moshe, and perhaps we'll get they'll shed some light on the Shaila as well. On the Shaila. Okay, so let's look at the next Taz. It says Shelo B'Fanav, Taz Hey, Kachu B'Rambam Behedya, that it's only Shelo B'Fanav that you could use the name when it's not an unusual name. The befanav aser b'shalacherim afilu bein apply. Befanav in front of the parent, it's aser even to call somebody else by the name, even if it's not unusual. The yisbar aviv shekare oso. That's the nakuda. The Taz says that's the svara. The reason why you can't use your father's name when you're referring to somebody else in front of your father is because he may think that you're calling him, and that's the gufa lack of cover. I'm calling my friend Moshe, but my father's name is Moshe, so I say, hey Moshe, come here a minute. So it gives the impression the first thing your father might even look up to see if you. So that's why that's aser. Your father might think you're calling him, and somebody another person who's present there also may think you're calling your father by his first name, which is gufa lack of cover. Okay, so then he says, "Vafal b'shabat takas hatur l'Rambam lo nizkar shelo b'fanav." Even though the Torah doesn't mention, "Ein bekach klum ki samach al hapashat." Uvidrisha herech kan lachlok al Rama b'mashigia shelo b'fanav. The drisha disagrees with the Ramah, with the Ramah adding the word shlo b'fanav. The Drisha says it would be mutter even b'fanav if it's not an unusual name, and you're referring to somebody. You're not referring to your father. You're referring to your friend Moshe, and you want to call Moshe. Come here a minute. I want to ask you something, and you mean your friend. So the Drisha says that's mutter. It's mutter even in front of your father. V'lo dak klal, but he wasn't careful at all. That's not the case. Says the Taz. But if you look at the Shach, Sif Katan Gimel, the Shach brings the Drisha. Shach says, "V'hadrisha kasav d'lacherim afilu b'fanav im eino plai." If it's not an unusual name, shari. V'chein b'plai shelo b'fanav. And by the same token, if it is an unusual name, as long as it's shelo b'fanav. And the only, according to the Drisha, the only isser is to use an unusual name in front of your father when you're referring to someone else. Okay, so the Shach brings this Drisha, presumably holds like the Drisha, that's what they say. So we have a Machlokes Shach and Taz here, whether it's mutter to use a common name that your father has, to use it to refer to somebody else in the presence of your father. The Taz says it's definitely not mutter, and it's medayik from the Ramah, and the Shach says, based on the Drisha, it is mutter. So Moshe finds it in a tshuva. This is in the first chelik of Yeridea, Simin Kuf Lamed Gimel. He has a tshuva where he discusses a number of the issues with name calling for a parent, and he says the svara of the Ramah, why it's usher b'fanav, even by a regular name like Rumadai, right? The Ramah says shalo b'fanav is usher by a shem ploy, but b'fanav is usher even not a shem ploy. So the reason is, like he says, like the Taz says, because people are going to think, your father himself might think, and other people might think that you're calling him, and that's like a covet. So Moshe says, Memela, if it's pasha that nobody's going to think that, it would be mutter. For example, let's say everybody calls your father by a title. Nobody calls him by his first name. Your father's another mechubit, and people don't call him by his first name. They call, or if they do use his first name, they use a title. Rabbi so and so or Reb so and so. Like even we find even by chashuva people, we tend to call him a Ramosha. Ramosha finds him. It's called Ramosha, and even b'fneim, it's common with there are many chashuvim that people call them like Reb so and so b'fneim. So if everybody does that, or even when they're referring to them, shalom b'fneim, they always use the title. Then it would not be usher for you to call someone else without that title. Right? Everybody calls your father Moshe. Nobody calls him Moshe. Everybody calls him Moshe. So when your friend Moshe is now in front of is there present in front of your father, and when you want to call your friend Moshe, so that would be mutter. Because when you said Moshe, nobody's going to think you're referring to your father. Because nobody calls him Moshe. They call him Reb Moshe. It's unheard of to call him Moshe.
Opposite applies. No one refers to my father as Reb so and so. So when I speak to my friend, I'll say Reb Moshe.
Yeah, if
my father would definitely not turn.
Okay, if it's a case that it would never be confused that way. Yes, that's what Ramesh is saying. Ramesh is saying these are just examples. Right? Ramesh is saying the yesod. The yesod is any time that it's not the mistake won't be made. It's mutter. So he says, and he takes it a step further. He says, "Memela in our circles where it's unheard of that a child should call his father by his name. It's unheard of. What child would call his father by his name, especially if his face, would address him by his name? So memela, it's mutter to call somebody else by his name, because your father will never think. Your father hears you say, Moshe, come here a minute. He'll never dream that you're referring to him. What a chutzpah. And nobody does it. It's not done. So that's what Moshe writes in the Tshuva. V'chein b'makom oseinu, shabanim karmel aviyim rak abba, tati or daddy or pa, whatever. Haray lo yitu klal lachshav shekari b'Hashem shehiskil aviv. So ein lesser afla harama. He says unless it's a shame plug. If it's an unusual name, then even now, even though people don't do it, you still can't do it. It seems the idea of an unusual name sort of goes beyond the boundaries, because it says even though it's not accepted to call your father by his name, so you normally wouldn't think that, but it's such an unusual name that when you used it already, so like you have to, on the one hand, nobody would call him by his, your child would never call him by his name. On the other hand, who else has their name? For example, I gave an example of clonimus. The example in our clonimus. I mean, it depends very much. It depends on certain, there's like certain names that in the Ashkenazic world are very, very common, but amongst the Sephardim, nobody would ever call them, Herschel, whatever, Herschel. You don't find Sfardim named Herschel or whatever. On the other hand, the Svardish names, many of them, the real Svardish names, many of them, you wouldn't have in the Ashkenazi circle. So if somebody had a name from the other, from the other Ada, and then that would be a shame play here. Over there, it wouldn't be. I saw also, just taking the idea of shame play, some say, or at least Choshesh, that shame play could be based on a combination. In other words, well, one thing is it's brought that the Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish's father's name was Shmaryahu Yosef, and it's brought that when he any of his nieces and nephews that were named Shmaryahu Yosef, he wouldn't refer to them by their name. Even if his father wasn't living, they were named after his father. The father wasn't living, but even Shelo B'chayav, he didn't want to use a shame plai even to refer to somebody else. Even Shelo B'chayav, and he held that Shmar Yosef was together a shame plai. I saw even more. I just saw now in this Sefer Kibud that he brings that. Let me just get the exact page where it was. So you could try to say it. Correctly, right here. Yeah, he says, "Shamati michacham echad shehagoyin Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik Zatzal." This was it was known as Rabbi Soloveitchik was a son of the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav is his name was Rabbi Yitzchak Zev, was a son of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, right? Son of the famous Reb Chaim Brisker. So the Brisker Rav's grandson, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, asked his father. He was making a bris for his child, and he was going to name his child Chaim, and his name was going to be. He was going to name him Chaim ben Yosef Dov. So he asked his father. He wanted to mechabed his father to name the baby, and his father said, "I can't do it." He said, "I can't say the name Chaim ben Yosef Dov because that's my father's name." And he held, that's what he says, he held that it was a shame play, right? Amalo shel yuch mishum dehu shame play. Darei lomer Chaim ben Yosef Dov. That shame play. Chaim's not at all unusual. Neither is Yosef Dov. None of the names by themselves were unusual, but the combination Chaim ben Yosef Dov, that's unique. Put it that way. I guess then let's say unusual. It's unique. It's unique. How many Chaim and Yosef Dovs are there? So Mamela, he didn't. Now it could be just the chumrah of the Brisker Rav Ladaf that he held this way, mamash halacha, but he didn't want to take the kibud of naming the baby because he didn't want to say that name. Okay, but so now getting back here, so number one, Ramesh says that to call somebody else by the name in front of the father would be mutter if it's clear that you're not referring to your father. Now, in general, in terms of the halacha, many say that the ikar halacha is like the drisha and the shach that it is mutter. If it's not a shame palai, that it's mutter in front of the father. In this sefer here called the Reach HaKamocha, he brings down the Haminugu lahakal kahashach v'adrisha, and he's mitzayim the chayodim. The chayodim paskins that way. And he quotes a psak from Rabbi Yashiv as well, brought in another sefer that maker then it's mutter. So, on top of that, we have Ramesh Svara that Kuliyama would agree in a case where nobody would do it. Now, I couldn't find the later where I saw in one of the Svarim wanted to say that since Ramesh's time it changed a little. It's not so unfortunately, but it's not so unheard of anymore that a child would call his father by his name. So it could be Ramesh's Svarah doesn't apply. In other words, Ramesh's basic lumkus applies that any time it's obvious and clear that you're not referring to your father because that's not the way your father's called, or you would never do that, then it's mutter. But he wants to say that it could be that in today's times it's not so obvious anymore. Okay. In any case, so the next shaila is though, what about using your father's name with a title? In other words, instead of just saying, the way we've learned, if somebody asks you what your father's name is, then you're not allowed to say it, right? According to everybody, right? The whole discussion we were just having now was about using somebody else's name. you're calling somebody else by your father's name, but your father himself, to actually referring to your father, you're not allowed to say his name, even shlo b'fanav, even if it's not an unusual name. That's clear. So the question is it mutter to do it if you add a title and you say l'mashal, you say either Rav so and so if he is a Rav, or maybe even Reb so and so, or Abba Murray so and so, things like that. If you add titles, is a mutter to say. Now the Lashon Shulchan Aruch is just to say Abba Murray, Ela Omer Abba Murray. So the question is, but could you then say his name as well? Let's say somebody asks you, he wants to know your father's name, so it's not going to help to say Abba Murray. He's asking your father's name for whatever reason, maybe like when the case was asked. So this is a machlokas machlokas between the amongst us, the Marshal and the Gra. The Gra held that it is mutter to do that. As long as you say Rabbi or some title of distinction of Kibud, then you're allowed to say then what his name is. Now, in this tshuva Igros Moshe that I mentioned before, he brings that Rav David Feinstein asked the kasha. Rav David asked his father a kasha because we find one of the main sources that you're not allowed to use your father's name even when he's not there. You're not allowed to use it when you're referring to him. Is from Rav Ashi. The Gemara says that when Rav Ashi would give a shir, and he would be quoting something. Not Rav Ashi, Marba Rav Ashi, the son of Rav Ashi. When Marba Rav Ashi would give a shir, and he would want to quote his father, he wouldn't say his name. He would, even though he was talking to the Maturgaman, he was talking to the person who's going to say over his Torah out loud to everyone. So he would just say, Kach Omar Abba Mari, Kach Abba Mari, or Avi Mari, Kach Omar Avi Mari, and then the Maturgaman would say it over Kach Omar Rav Ashi. But Marba Rav Ashi himself didn't say it. He didn't even say Kach Omar, Avi Mari Rav Ashi. So how do we know that it's how do we know that it's mutter? Or if he didn't, if it was mutter, why didn't he do it? So Moshe wants to say perhaps that it's only when you in a public drasha that's usher to say it at all. He's darshaning barabim, then that would be a greater lack of kavod, a greater pchisus kavod to use the name barabim. Whereas when he's talking privately to someone, then it would not be a problem. That's what he suggests, perhaps to answer up, for the Gra. The Marshal, however, holds it's not mutter, no matter what. The Marshal holds it's not, well, not no matter what. The Marshal holds is not mutter, even privately, it's not mutter to use the name, even with the title. So Rabbi writes that it's kedai to be machmir, but if there's a tzarech, then even according to the Marshal, it's okay. Meaning to say, a case like this, a case where you're quoting your father, you don't have to say his name. You're quoting something from your father, so don't use his name. Say Abba Mari. But if somebody needs to know your father's name, then you could. Then for sure it's okay as long as you put a title. The right is because it says by a Rebbe. A Rebbe for sure you're allowed to do that. If you want to say over something in your Rebbe's name, so people don't necessarily know who your Rebbe is. So you want to say, so you're allowed to say, Mori for Rebbe, whatever. Like you hear some people that says. Mori Rebbe or Pam, Mori Rebbe or Moshe, Mori Rebbe, whoever it is. People say Mori Rebbe, and then they say the name because they want to identify who they're quoting. I don't necessarily know who he's quoting, who his Rebbe is, but your father's your father. People, your father. People know your father is, or perhaps the name isn't so important, or isn't so integral. But you're saying, I heard this from my father. But if the name is integral, because that's exactly what they want to know, then it'd be okay. So the question was asked before. Gabi comes over, wants to give you an aliyah. Says, how are you called up? So then, there he needs your father's name because that's the derech how we call people up. So for sure, if you say with a title, it's for sure okay. Now, in fact, some suggest that in a case like that, it's okay even without a title, because I'm just saying my father's name in the context of my name. I'm not naming my father per se. I'm saying my name is David Ben Moshe. I'm saying that like is my name. But whereas if per se asks me what is your father's name, for whatever reason he wants to call your father up friendly or whatever, and he comes over to the son and says, your father, what's your father's name? So then for sure he would have to say, he would be allowed to say it, but only with the title. Now, which was saying the shaila is with a title. How far does that go? Is the title Reb sufficient, or let's say in English, Mister? Somebody wants to know your father's English name, and so or even if it's not his English name, whatever it is, but they want to know. So they're not asking for an aliyah. They're writing something down, and they ask your father's name. You're interviewing for something on the phone. Okay, what's your name? Okay, what's your father's name? So the question is, saying Mister sufficient? So most of the farms that I saw say it is. Rabbi Yasha brings that to Lav Davka, that he doesn't think it is because everybody's Mister. Mister is not. It has to be something that's beyond the norm that you wouldn't necessarily call another person. But if it's something that you would call anybody, you use that name, that title for anybody, so then it doesn't show any particular chashivas to your father. That's what Rabbi Yasha suggests. Now I'm not sure how far that goes with Reb. Reb, Reb is not. Mister is common in English. Reb perhaps is a little bit better, and it could be that even goes Rabbi Yashiv, that would be good. But as I said, most of the poskim seem to feel that would be okay. Even something like Mister would be okay.
Where did you say my father's name?
No, so you shouldn't just say my father's name is Moshe or Moshe ben David. That you shouldn't say without any title. You definitely should add a title. Especially again, if they're not asking you your name, they're asking you they want to call your father. Your father's name is Moshe ben David. You for sure shouldn't say that my father's name is. You could say as a title, Abba Murray Moshe ben David, and not that the Gabi is going to use the words Abba Murray, but you could say it, the Abba Murray Moshe ben David, or say at least Reb Moshe ben David. And when they're asking, as I said, when they're asking your name, and your name is David ben Moshe, so it's still much better to add a title. You say David ben Reb Moshe. This do it that way, or certainly if he's a Rav, then of course you would use that title.
This has happened to me where someone knows the Gabi knows my name, but he doesn't remember my father's name. My father's not going to get an aliyah because he's really calling me up
Right.
that sense.
But he said already, and he wants you to fill in the blank.
So am I allowed?
So you have to say you should put a title on. Say at least Reb, or say Ben Abba Murray, whatever it is, and say his name. Okay. Now, 1 second here. Okay. Now there's a shaila b'chlal whether the word Murray or Mori is critical. The Shulchan Aruch said, if you saw it, if you want to take it, you have it actually in front of you there too. Shulchan Aruch in Siv Beis, he said, Ela Omer, don't say his name, Ela Omer Abba Murray. So the shaila does that mean it's insufficient just to say Abba? Must you say certainly when you're referring to your father, if you want to call your father, do you have to say Abba Mari Davka, or is it enough to say Abba, or when you're referring to him as well? So Reb Moshe points out in the same tshuva that l'chara the title Mari is not absolutely necessary, as he says, "Afila below his kishmo terech and davgamar," etc. One second. Where was it? He brings in one of these paragraphs that we find later in the Shulchan Aruch when it talks about if somebody is asking a favor for somebody, so it's a cover for your father to say, do it in honor of my father. It's mechabed your father. So there, the Lashon Shulchan Aruch is asay b'shvil Abba. It doesn't say b'shvil Abba Mari. So Rashi says, you see that Mari is lav davki. You don't always have to use the title Mari. Now, I did see in the Sefer L'Reach HaKamocha that the author of this Sefer, he asked this Shaila to Ruchaim Kanievsky that how is it the Shulchan Aruch over there leaves out the word Mari? So Ruchaim says over there it's lav davka. It means Mari. So it was Mekatzer, but it means Mari. Rashi clearly in the Shuvah says not that way. Rashi says that you see from the Shulchan Aruch that it's that Adrab, that Mari is lav davka. It's enough to say but there are Gemaras like that as well, because there are Gemaras where they said Yochai Avi and expressions like that. So Rashi learns this lav davka. But so in this Sefer Ura Kavodi, he brings down. Let me just get where the place was. Page Kuf Lametes. Yeah. First, he also brings. Ramesh in that Shuvah also wants to say that the whole idea of having to say Abba Mori is, he brings from the Aruch HaShulchan and from the Igros Moshe that it's Abba Mori would only be if you're darshaning barabim. That barabim you should have to say Abba Mori, but to say Shalom barabim, just to say Abba would be okay. Then he brings from the Ben Ish Chai that it's tali l'fi minhag. If the minhag is to use, if people typically use that, add that title, add the expression Mori, then you should do it. Otherwise, lav davka. And at the end, he brings it from Yashav a similar thing that he quotes the Sefer Avnei Yashvei that says, Mistama, when a person wants to say Shalom Aleichem to his father, he should say Shalom Alecha Avi Mori. So he brings from Yashav Shalot Tzarich Lahakid B'Zeh Hayom Ki Ahor Meina Makpidam Al Zeh Ve'Mochlem Al Kavodim. And you could say just Shalom Aleichem Abba. You don't have to say Avi Mori. So it seems that that's one approach, that if it's not typically done, then you don't have to do it, possibly because there's an inherent mechila.
How far do we take Michael and Kibud? Today, most people don't stand up for their fathers.
Right.
And
So
fathers are generally Michael and Kibud.
right. So we're actually going to discuss that separately. But Hashem, I'm trying to go into Shulchan Aruch, and that comes up later, actually, in Sif Yutes. So, but Lamaisa, the bottom line is that the father is really mochel. So technically, just the short answer is anything that's not a bizayon. If it's not a bizayon, if not a bizayon for him, then you're allowed to be samech on it. There's a mila not to be samech on it. There's a mila to do it anyway, allowed to get schar. And there are those that want to say that there's an onish in shamayim if you are samech on it. So, which is hard to understand. I mean, so it says it's mochel. So how can they But hopefully, we'll talk about that. Get to the top of it, Hashem. But there's also Chazon Ish that brings down that it's not really good for the parent to be mochel on a regular basis. So, these are the highlights for Mr. Hashem before we got to that topic. Now, there's a big question in the Svarim. What about writing? Are you allowed to write your father's name? Let's say without any title. So there are different days about this, and Ramesh writes in one place in this tshuva that it's not us, or it seems that it's not us, or Meikar Adin. The preferred method is that you should do it. You should write. Should do it means you should add a title. Even if you're writing your parent's name, you should preferably add some sort of title. But if it's not feasible, if it's out of place, let's say you're filling out an application, or go to a doctor and first time there and you fill out the form, whatever, and to write Mr. or Reb or something would just be a little awkward. So then it says you could be Mekel and just write the name. And also, when you're writing your own name, so here they say it seems that a chasima is different. We mentioned that for a little bit before, even when you're saying your name for an aliyah, but there we said it's better to add a title, definitely better. But when you're signing your name, see, there's less of a hakpada, because, like I said, writing your father's name, even if you're just writing your father's name itself, is not so pashit. There you should be makbel. Let's say you're writing a check out to your father, so you shouldn't just write his name. You should write a title, or you're sending him something in the mail, addressing an envelope. You should not just write his name on the. You should put a title, at least Mister. And if you want to be, or Lachari, if you want to be makbid, that Mister is not good enough, and nothing else is really appropriate. So maybe don't write the name. Maybe just write the initial. You don't have to write it just his initial. Lachari, that would be what to do without any specific title other than certainly Mister would be good enough for that. But when you're signing your name, so there it seems that we find the person signs a get. Dafka don't put any titles. They're not, but only put the name. When you're signing ksuba, most allow if you want to put in a title, you want to put in so and so Ben Reb or Ben Harav. I've seen by one Rosh Hashiva who was makbid. No, just got to write the same way you sign a get. Moshe Ben David, no titles, not on your name, not on your father's name. But most that I've seen are not makbid on the ksuba, but in the get they definitely are. And we find many of the gedolim sign the Rambam used to say, "I need Moshe Ben Maimon," and many of the gedolim sign their names just with their father's name without any title. So it seems a chasima is a different concept. It's not considered p'chisus kavod if you sign your name and you mesiachas yourself to your father without writing a title. What did bother me though, what does bother me is I've seen Tzira Gittin in a number of places, and they always ask the husband or the wife, their name and their father's name. The get will have their name and their father's name. So I don't recall ever seeing them be makbid to tell the people when they ask the father's name, don't just make sure add a title or whatever it is. And they're saying the father's name separately because they don't ask him, okay, tell me your name, okay, Moshe ben David. That's not the way it works, because each name they have to get the name very clear, and then nicknames and Hebrew names, English names. So they focus on each part of the name separately. So they'll finish with his name and say, okay, what's your father's name? And I don't know. It's just
have them write it. That's the best way to.
Yeah, well, it would be hard though, because often there's a lot of grilling, or not grilling, but a lot of questioning back and forth. What name does he use? He has two names. Does he use both names? Does he use his Hebrew name? Does he use his English name? There are a lot of questions to get clarity in the Kviyas Shem. So maybe that's gooful. Why? Maybe if you have to start asking him to use titles, say Reb or Mister, each time it just might throw off the process, and you can't afford that. I mean, the Kviyas Shem of the get is a very, very ikr part of every get. So maybe that's why they don't do it. Maybe they figure, I don't know if they figure the parents are mochel also under those, under that setting, under that circumstance where it's being done. It's almost like, it's much like a technical thing, which, they're certainly only using the father's name there to identify the person. That's for sure. They're not using the father's name to refer per se to the father, but maybe that's the reason. Okay, a couple of other shilas. What about if the person's father's name is Abba? That's a name, common name. So is he allowed to say Abba? He's allowed to say Shalom Alecha Abba to his father. If that's his name. So many say that it is mutter. That it's clear that the son doesn't mean it as his name. It's clear that he's using it just as a title, or they bring there's a woman's name Mazel Tov, especially in the Sephardic world, Mazel Tov. So if one's mother has a simcha and she's marrying up a child, or she had a child, you want to say Mazel Tov, Mazel. You want to say to your mother Mazel Tov Ima, or just Mazel Tov. So many say that it's mutter. Many say it's mutter to do it. There are chalkim, but many say it's mutter to do it because again it's just derech covered there. There's no question that you're not using their name. You're not referring to them. You're saying the word happens to be the same letters and the same sounds, but you're not calling the name. So maybe the worst that would be is like the idea of calling somebody else. You can't even call somebody else with that name, even though you're not referring to them. So we said on that, at least according to Rabbi, but if it's obvious that you're not referring to them by their name, then you could. So here too, that would be a reason why this would be okay. It's obvious that you're not calling them by their name. You're giving them a bracha, or wishing them well. Okay. Also saw. Many people will. We had the shir about names a few weeks ago. So if you're naming a child, so in the Ashkenazic world, that they'll only use the name of a parent after the parent is no longer living. So then it's okay to call the child. You're not referring to the parent; you're referring to the child. So that's okay. It's shalom b'fanav. Certainly, it's not a shame polai, right? It's shalom b'fanav. It's mutter even if he's living. Certainly, when he's gone, when he's gone, even a shame polai pasha is a mutter. I mentioned before the Chazon Ish was makbid, but b'pshuta shel davar, even an unusual name is mutter to refer to somebody else when the parent's not living. The bigger shals amongst the Sephardim, they use the name even when the parents are living. And so they can name their child whatever it may be, and very often it's going to be the grandfather's there, and their father's there, and their child's there. So it's what they have to be careful. They have to be careful not to call. I mean, again, if you're passing like the shach and the drisha, so as long as it's a regular name, it wouldn't be usher, right? A regular name, calling somebody else is not usher. But like the Taz, that's usher. So and certainly if it's a shame play, it's for sure usher. So they would have to be careful to make some sort of shinu. It's like the lashon we have in the Mechaber, Mishana Shmam. That was the lashon, right? Mishana v'hayishem aviv yikrena Hashem aviv kishem acher Mishana Shmam. So that's what the Sfar recommend, that they would have to be Mishana the shem and call the child by not by his exact name, but to make a shtickle shinu in the name. Okay, that's there's a lot of other shilas here in this, but I think we covered the basics.